The sun hung low over the Nevada desert, stretching golden rays across a lonely highway. Heat waves shimmered over the cracked asphalt as a sleek black motorcycle roared down the empty road. Keanu Reeves, feeling the familiar embrace of the open road, allowed the wind to sweep through his hair, his mind lost in thought. He wasn't running from anything, just chasing the silence only an empty road could offer. Then, in the distance, he spotted it. A small, rundown gas station, the only sign of civilization for miles. Its neon, open 24 hours sign flickered weakly, some letters burned out, making it read more like OEN2HURS. The sight made Keanu smirk. A forgotten relic in the middle of nowhere. He pulled into the station, parking beside the lone working pump. As he swung his leg off the bike, he felt an odd stillness in the air, not just the quiet of the desert, but something heavier. Something unseen. The door to the station creaked open, and a young woman stepped out. She looked barely 20, her brown hair tied in a messy ponytail. Her uniform was loose-fitting, but even under the fabric, it was impossible to miss the small curve of her belly. She was pregnant. Keanu noticed the exhaustion in her eyes. The way her hands fidgeted as she walked toward him. Something about her demeanor set off a quiet alarm in his head. "Good evening, sir," she said, voice soft, careful. "Full tank?" He nodded. "Yeah. Full, please." She set to work, but Keanu caught the slight tremor in her hands. Then the door behind her swung open again. A man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of hard face that told a story of too many bar fights and a lifetime of bad decisions. His expression was unreadable, but his posture spoke volumes, arms crossed, feet planted firmly, eyes locked on the young woman. Keanu watched as the girl stiffened, her shoulders curling inward as if trying to make herself smaller. She avoided looking at the man completely, but Keanu didn't miss the way her hands fumbled slightly with the nozzle. "You're taking too damn long," the man muttered, voice sharp, cutting through the still air. The girl flinched. "Sorry, Hank." Keanu's gaze flickered between them. The dynamic was clear. Too clear. Hank's eyes landed on Keanu then, taking him in, the leather jacket, the bike, the quiet intensity in his expression. Hank smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Need anything else?" the girl asked, trying to sound normal. "Coffee," Keanu said after a beat. He didn't need coffee. He just needed a reason to step inside. She hurried back into the store, and Keanu followed. The inside was even worse than he expected, dimly lit, shelves cluttered with expired snacks, the faint smell of mildew in the air. Behind the counter, the girl moved quickly, pouring his coffee with shaky hands. Hank leaned against the doorway, arms still crossed. Watching. Always watching. When the girl handed Keanu his change, their fingers brushed for the briefest second. And that's when he felt it, a slight squeeze. A message without words, then before he could react, she slipped the receipt into his palm. The way she did it was so subtle that if Keanu hadn't been paying attention, he would have missed it. He took his coffee, nodded, and walked out. Only when he was back by his bike did he glance at the receipt. The words scrawled across the back made his stomach clench. "Help. Please don't let him see this." Keanu exhaled slowly, his heartbeat suddenly heavier. He lifted his eyes back toward the store. Through the glass window, the girl stood behind the counter, her hands resting over her stomach in a protective gesture, and then he saw it. Hank, slowly turning the lock on the front door, sealing her inside. Keanu's grip tightened around the receipt. His mind raced. He could ride away, pretend he never saw anything, but he knew better. This wasn't just a bad situation. This was a cage. And she was trapped, and Keanu Reeves never ignored a call for help. Keanu stayed by his bike, pretending to check something on the dashboard, but his mind was already working through the situation. He had been in dangerous places before, on and off screen. And one thing he knew for sure was that Hank wasn't just some overbearing boss. This wasn't just about control. It was about possession. Keanu subtly scanned his surroundings. The gas station was isolated, a perfect place for someone to disappear. No security cameras outside. No other customers. Just the girl, trapped with a man who clearly wanted to keep her that way. He had to act carefully. If Hank had been keeping her prisoner, he wasn't going to let her walk out without a fight. Keanu tucked the receipt into his pocket and moved to the side of the building. He needed to find another way in. He tested a side door handle, unlocked. That was strange. A man as controlling as Hank wouldn't just leave an entrance open unless he was arrogant enough to believe no one would ever dare to use it. Keanu took a quiet breath and stepped inside. The back room smelled of stale beer and old oil. A dirty mattress lay in the corner, blankets piled haphazardly. There was barely any furniture, only a chair and a small table covered in cigarette burns, and then his eyes landed on the chain. It was bolted to the wall, the other end wrapped around the leg of the mattress. Keanu clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a bad situation. This was a prison. A quiet noise made him freeze. He turned his head just in time to see her. The girl stood in the doorway, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. She didn't scream. Didn't move. She just stared at him, her breath shallow. Keanu lifted his hands slightly, showing he wasn't a threat. "It's okay," he said softly. "I saw your message." Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she looked past him toward the chain. Keanu followed her gaze and felt something sharp twist in his chest. "How long?" he asked quietly. She swallowed hard. "A few months," she whispered. "Since I got pregnant." Keanu's fingers curled into fists. "Hank." She nodded. Her voice was barely a breath. "He won't let me leave." Keanu exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He had to get her out. But rushing would be dangerous. "Do you have a phone?" he asked. She shook her head. "He took it." "Of course he did." Keanu glanced back at the chain. "Does he always lock you up?" Her hands instinctively wrapped around her stomach. "Not when I'm working," she said. "But at night, always." Keanu pulled out a small pocket knife and knelt by the chain, testing its strength. It was thick, but not unbreakable. He could cut through it. Footsteps. Heavy. Close. Keanu barely had time to move before a deep voice filled the room. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Keanu turned slowly. Hank stood in the doorway, his face twisted into a smirk, his hand gripping a hunting knife at his waist, and the worst part, he wasn't angry. He was amused. Like he had done this before, like he had won every single time. Not tonight. Keanu rose to his full height, his eyes locking onto Hank's with quiet steel. He had been in a lot of fights, and if this guy wanted one, Keanu would be happy to give it to him. Hank tilted his head, his grip tightening around the hunting knife. His smirk didn't falter, but Keanu saw something in his eyes. Calculation. Hank wasn't rushing him blindly. He was gauging the situation, deciding whether Keanu was a threat or just another fool sticking his nose where it didn't belong. "I'll give you one chance," Hank said casually, taking a slow step forward. "Turn around, walk out that door, and forget you ever saw anything." Keanu didn't move. Hank sighed, rolling his shoulders. "You really don't want to do this, man?" Keanu's voice was calm. "Neither do you." For the first time, Hank's smirk faltered. Just for a second. Just enough for Keanu to see it doubt. Then Hank lunged. Keanu was ready. Hank swung the knife in a quick arc, aiming for Keanu's side. Keanu sidestepped smoothly, grabbing Hank's wrist mid-swing and twisting. Hank grunted, trying to yank free, but Keanu moved fast, using the momentum to drive his elbow into Hank's ribs. Hank staggered back, gasping, but he wasn't done. He came back harder, throwing a wild punch with his free hand. Keanu blocked it, deflecting the blow with precision. Hank was strong, but he was sloppy, relying more on brute force than skill. Keanu, on the other hand, had spent decades perfecting the art of controlled movement. Hank slashed the knife again. This time, the blade grazed Keanu's jacket, cutting through the leather. Close, but not close enough. Keanu seized the opening. He grabbed Hank's arm, twisting it at an unnatural angle. The knife clattered to the floor. Hank swore and swung again, but Keanu ducked, driving his fist into Hank's gut. The force knocked the air from his lungs. Hank collapsed to his knees, wheezing. Keanu stepped back, kicking the knife away. For the first time, real fear flickered across Hank's face. He wasn't in control anymore. Keanu turned to the girl. "Keys," he said quickly. "Where are they?" She hesitated for only a second before darting toward a metal cabinet near the back wall. She yanked open the drawer, fumbling through a mess of papers and tools before pulling out a set of keys. Hank growled, trying to push himself up. Keanu stepped forward and planted a firm boot against his chest, shoving him back down. "Stay," Keanu said, his voice low and controlled. Hank glared up at him, fury burning in his eyes. But he didn't move. The girl hurried back, clutching the keys. Her hands were shaking. "I got them." Keanu nodded. "Go. Now." She hesitated, looking at Hank. Fear still lingered in her eyes, like she was waiting for him to lash out. Keanu met her gaze. "He can't hurt you anymore." Something in his tone, steady, unshaken, made her believe him. She nodded once, gripping the keys tighter, and bolted toward the exit. Keanu followed, stepping over Hank without a second glance. He could hear the man's labored breathing, the wheezing sound of someone who had just realized they weren't the strongest person in the room anymore. Keanu reached the door first, pushing it open. The night air hit them like a wave, cool against their overheated skin. The girl ran toward a rusty old sedan parked near the side of the station. She fumbled with the keys, trying to get the door open. Then Hank roared behind them. Keanu spun just in time to see him charging forward, blind with rage. No weapon this time. Just fury. Keanu met him head-on. With one swift movement, Keanu sidestepped and grabbed Hank's arm, using his own momentum against him. He twisted sharply, sending Hank crashing face first into the side of the building. Hank hit the wall hard and crumpled to the ground, groaning. Keanu turned back to the girl. Go. She finally got the car door open and scrambled inside, hands trembling as she shoved the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. Keanu stepped back as the car lurched forward, kicking up dust as it sped toward the highway. She was free. Keanu exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. His work here was done, or so he thought, because as he turned back toward his bike, he heard something in the distance. Sirens. Red and blue lights appeared on the horizon, growing brighter by the second. Keanu smirked. Perfect timing. Hank groaned from the ground. Barely conscious. You called the cops? Keanu crouched beside him, his voice cool and unwavering. The second I saw the receipt. Hank's eyes widened in realization. He had lost, and Keanu Reeves never ignored a call for help. The flashing red and blue lights painted the gas station in pulses of color as the police cars skidded to a stop, kicking up dust. Doors flew open and officers spilled out, weapons drawn. Keanu stood calmly, hands relaxed at his sides, watching as they moved in. Two officers rushed to Hank, who was still groaning on the ground. Stay down, one of them barked, pinning his arms behind his back before snapping handcuffs around his wrists. Hank didn't resist. He just chuckled darkly, spitting blood onto the pavement. You think this changes anything? He muttered, eyes flicking up toward Keanu. Keanu crouched slightly, meeting his gaze. Yeah, he said. I do. Hank bared his teeth like a cornered animal, but there was no fight left in him. The officers hauled him to his feet and shoved him toward the patrol car. He didn't get the chance to say anything else before they slammed the door shut. Another officer approached Keanu, sizing him up. You the one who called this in? Keanu nodded. She slipped me a message. Said she needed help. The officer exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. We've had suspicions about this place for a while. Reports of missing girls, people stopping through and never making it out. He glanced toward the lockdown gas station. Never had enough proof to move in until now. Keanu didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned his attention down the highway where the taillights of the rusty sedan had long since disappeared into the night. She was gone. Free, and that was all that mattered. Hours later, the sky had begun to lighten, the first hints of dawn creeping over the horizon. Keanu leaned against his motorcycle outside a small police station, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee. Then, the station doors creaked open. Emily stepped out. She was wearing fresh clothes, an old hoodie and jeans a kind officer had scrounged up for her. She looked different now. Still tired. Still pale. But lighter. Like something heavy had finally been lifted from her shoulders. She saw Keanu and hesitated. Then, slowly, she walked toward him. For a moment, neither of them spoke, then she let out a shaky breath. I don't know what to say. Keanu shrugged. You don't have to say anything. Emily swallowed hard. I thought I'd be stuck there forever. You're not. She looked down at the cracked pavement. I don't even know where to go. Keanu reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He pressed it into her hands. She frowned, confused. Then she peeked inside. Her eyes widened. Keanu, I can't take this. Yes, you can. His voice was steady. It's yours. She clutched the envelope, struggling to find the words. Finally, she whispered, Why? Keanu met her gaze. Because now you get to decide what happens next. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. For the first time in a long time, she had a choice. She looked down the road, the same empty road Keanu had ridden in on, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a dead end. It felt like freedom. Keanu put on his helmet and swung a leg over his bike. Before he started the engine, he looked at her one last time. Be free, Emily. She smiled, and as Keanu rode off into the horizon, the wind carried a single scrap of paper away from the gas station, the receipt, now crumpled and forgotten. The words help were still scribbled on the back, but now they weren't a cry for escape. They were proof that someone had listened, and that made all the difference. The desert stretched endlessly as Keanu Reeves rode through the fading darkness, the echo of the night's events still fresh in his mind. The road ahead was empty, but his thoughts were not. Emily was safe. That mattered, yet something gnawed at him. Hank's last words. You think this changes anything? There was something in that tone, something that felt unfinished. Like a loose thread in a story that wasn't quite over. Keanu slowed his bike, pulling onto the shoulder. The night air was cool now, but it did nothing to ease the heat in his chest. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the crumpled receipt. Help. The ink was smudged from the sweat of his grip, but the words still stared back at him, solid and undeniable. He thought of the way the officer had spoken about the gas station. Reports of missing girls. People stopping through and never making it out. It wasn't just about Emily. This was bigger. Keanu's jaw clenched. He could have left this behind. He could have let the police handle it, trusted them to tie up the loose ends, but that wasn't who he was. He started the engine again, but instead of riding away, he turned the bike around, heading back toward the gas station. By the time Keanu reached the rundown station, the flashing lights were gone. The police had done their job. Hank was in cuffs. The nightmare should have ended, but something felt wrong. The front door was still locked, but Keanu wasn't interested in the obvious entrance. He moved around the side of the building, back to the door he'd slipped through before, still unlocked. He stepped inside. The stale scent of old beer and motor oil still clung to the air. The mattress in the corner sat undisturbed, the chain still bolted to the wall like a forgotten relic of captivity. Keanu's eyes narrowed. If Emily had been the only one trapped here, why keep the chain? He moved closer, scanning the floor, the walls. His boots scuffed against the dust-covered surface, revealing faint indentations, drag marks. Something had been moved. Someone. A sinking feeling settled in his gut. Keanu followed the marks to the farthest corner of the room, where an old wooden panel jutted out slightly from the wall. He pressed against it. It groaned under his touch, shifting just enough to reveal what lay beyond. A door. His breath slowed. Keanu pushed it open. The staircase led downward, the air thick with dampness and something else, something rotting. The dim glow of a single, flickering bulb revealed a narrow basement lined with metal shelves, rusted cans, empty bottles, crates stacked against the walls, and a single, locked cage. Keanu's pulse hammered. A figure huddled inside, too thin, too still. He took a step closer, and the person flinched, drawing their knees tighter against their chest. A girl, no older than 16. Her dark hair was matted, her face streaked with dried tears. She wasn't the only one. Keanu's stomach turned as his eyes adjusted. There were more. 3, 4, 5. Trapped, forgotten, left behind when Hank was taken away. A sharp breath rattled from Keanu's chest. He crouched, keeping his voice steady, gentle. Hey, you're okay now? The girl stared at him, unblinking. Keanu reached for his pocket knife, working on the first lock. The metal groaned, snapping loose. The girl didn't move at first, like she wasn't sure if she was dreaming. Then she whispered, "Is he gone?" Keanu nodded. "Yeah, he's gone." The girl's lip trembled. The others stirred as if the words themselves had shaken something loose in them. Keanu didn't waste time. One by one, he freed them, guiding them toward the staircase. The last girl, barely a child, hesitated at the bottom step. She turned to look at the cage one final time, then up at Keanu. He said no one would ever find us. Keanu's throat tightened. Well, he said, his voice steady, he was wrong. She took his hand, and together they walked into the light. The sun was rising by the time the sirens came again. The same officers from before, now with backup. Keanu stood by his bike, watching as the girls were helped into blankets, given water, checked over by medics. An officer approached him, the same one who had questioned him before. This time, his expression was different. "You went back." Keanu met his gaze. "Had to." The officer exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief. "We might have never found them." Keanu didn't respond. He just watched as the girls, now free, were led into waiting cars, their haunted eyes slowly beginning to see the world again. The weight in his chest eased. It was over. Truly over. As Keanu swung a leg over his bike. The officer called out, "You know, most people would have just kept driving." Keanu smirked, adjusting his helmet. "I'm not most people." And with that, he rode off into the horizon, the road stretching infinitely before him. The past was behind him, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the future was ahead.